So welcome back, and we'll reflect on that video in a second and see what you thought of it. We've been looking at self-awareness, its principles, and how emotions and how emotional intelligence fits in. And let's just quickly review what the speaker had to say, and I'll pick out some points that I thought were really relevant. The main points that I thought were really interesting was he said we're all reluctant learners and we need to be open-minded, and I think this course is an example. We need to not say that we know it all. We need to think about being open-minded and taking on board things. We need to be aware of our unconscious bias, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but we've already talked about how quick the brain is to react to things without us even knowing it, and we need to be aware of our assumptions and our perceptions. We need to understand our four basic emotions. He talked about those and knowing our triggers, and he talked about the steps towards that on know your triggers, learn to recognize when they're coming, and know how to cope with them, have a plan. He also went on to talk about the simple sort of terminology for emotional intelligence, because everyone can give it technical names, but he talked about the ability to use our own emotional knowledge of self and others to inform our choices, which I think is really good. And finally, I started to pick up on the fact that he was talking about, examples of when we get angry and taking our emotions out of it. We need to have an action to take it out. And then he talked about the domains that Goldman had talked about as well: self-assessment, self-regulation, and how we need to work on these. And we looked at that Goldman's theory, and we looked at some other theories. I hope you sort of overall found it all interesting, and that you'll remain open-minded to it, and we'll start to pull some of those things together. But emotional intelligence and how we use it can be key to be an effective manager. So back to our topic of self-awareness, and being self-aware and making judgments about our performance is all about getting feedback. We've talked about self-reflection, and we're going to focus more on that later, but that's almost self-feedback. But there's a problem. We can be very biased about our own feedback, about how we thought we'd done, in a positive and a negative way, I might add. So we need to make sure that we get feedback from a number of sources so that we can sort of validate that and look at it from a different perception. So let's start having a look at gathering feedback. So we can gather feedback from many areas. There's a wide choice of information out there, and they can all work together to help us give a sort of better picture of how we're performing and what we're doing. And the first sort of ones to start we'll look at is coaching. We'll look at some different types and methods of coaching briefly, tools that you can use from coaching. We'll look at where we get feedback from others, from our peers, from our colleagues, and we'll look at psychometric tools, and we'll just go through a few briefly. We'll then take a look at some management performance tools that are available from within the workplace. We'll look at self-reflection in the next session, a little bit more detail, but we've already talked about how reflecting on what we've done and our performance can help us. And finally, we'll take a look at unconscious bias tests and how we can be aware of the unconscious bias we might hold and how we can test it. So let's have a look at some of those. So firstly and importantly, feedback from others. What does that give us? Well, it's feedback from colleagues, peers, friends, even family, and it can help us balance our own self-reflection. Let's say observations, how they saw them differently. Perhaps our experiences of relationships, our experience of situations, and the feedback we received in those. And it can come in formal and informal methods. And what I mean by that is, formal could be an official sort of feedback, like an appraisal or something, but an appraisal more comes into a management tool, but something formal. Or it could be something informal, which wasn't necessarily meant as feedback, just stuff from our customers, stuff from staff that just shows they're happy, and if they're happy and they feel satisfied, then we must be doing something right. But we need to be aware of a couple of things when we're looking at this: the perspective they're coming from, what's their view, what are they looking at it from, have they got any skills or experience to pass any judgments? What was the situation? Was it an unusual situation? Was it a standard situation, an emergency situation? And that could give a different feeling from those people. And was there any bias, any conscious or unconscious bias? And we'll talk about unconscious bias in a little while. But very important, the feedback we can receive from others, because it can give us that balanced picture of our own self-reflection. So use some tools from coaching. So we could be using this ourselves, or they could be within a coaching session we're going through. And one of them we're going to look at in a bit more detail in a second is Johari window, which is just a simple tool of self-awareness. There's personal SWOT analysis, that's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, used in business but easily adapted as a personal tool to look at your own areas and make yourself more aware. There are self-awareness cards, usually used in a sort of game environment to try and get people to learn from social skills and fun, and the cards normally describe different characters and you discuss and talk about how they fit in. For example, there's one around pack types, which is focused on pack types of dogs, saying that hounds are people who are creative and other types of dogs are different types, and it's just talking about how a pack needs a little bit of all. So in group team situations it can be used to inform you about yourself. And then finally, the Wheel of Life, a tool that is used to look at your overall life and how everything's fitting together, and we'll look at that briefly, and we'll also look at how you can use that in a leadership scenario. So let's start by having a look at Johari window. So Johari window, a simple tool that helps to build relationships and trust, or it can be used to recognize areas for improvement in relationships. So it can be used both ways, and that's really by learning where to share information. There's a video in the resources which goes through it again if you need to, but we'll just quickly sort of look at it. So it's a matrix divided into 4 areas. The axis across the top is asking about yourself, and the axis down the side is telling information about yourself. And if we look at the boxes, everything that falls in the open box on the top line is info that you know and they know. So you could have shared, for example, your work history or details about your family with your team. The next one, the blind, is where they see something or know something and you don't. So it could be that they see you as low in confidence and you don't, or it could be that they see you as always giving in to someone or being biased to someone, like it might be an unconscious bias, so you're blind to it. The bottom row where we've got hidden, that's where you know something and others don't. So that could be personal information, it could be your fears, and sometimes that's intentional because you're self-avoiding it, or sometimes it's unintentional and you're just putting up a facade that you don't really realize is there. And then finally we have the unknown at the bottom, which is where no one recognizes, so things you don't know about yourself and things other people haven't, so hidden stuff that hasn't really come out yet, talents or information that you haven't really realized. And if we want to build open relationships, we're trying to enlarge the open area. Obviously we've got to be careful what we share, but being more self-aware, sharing information with others and being open and showing open communication is going to build that relationship and trust, and that's going to make us more aware, so we can use it to look at how our relationships currently are and see where we think we can improve it, and what they don't know about us and what we can tell them, or we can use it to evaluate where we are in a relationship and decide if we think we're getting it right. So that's the Johari window in short, but like I say, there's a video in the resources if you want to know more. So the Wheel of Life is another simple tool, often used by life coaches and basically used to help people focus on where their lives are going, or what's going well, what's not going well. As you can see on this example, people plot in certain areas, so how their personal development is scored 1 to 10, how they feel their finances are, their health, their play, their social life, their family life, their home life, their creativity, their relationship. In fact, whatever's on there, this is a standard Wheel of Life, but there can be different areas on there. In fact, in the resources, there's one based on leadership. So it's a Wheel of Leadership, and it's got all the characteristics of a good leader around the outside, and you score yourself against it. The idea is not to score 10 in everything. The idea is to try and have a balance. So, for example, in this Wheel of Life, creativity is low, but personal development is high. Family life is not that high, and finances aren't that good. So it could be about trying to balance out those things and focus on those things to try and bring their score up a bit. So again, just another tool we can use to try and work out or reflect on where we see things going and set some new goals or targets. Another method we can use is psychometric tools. Now, psychometric tools, or tests as they're often known, are like a standard scientific method that's used to measure individuals' mental capacity, their behaviour, their personality. You know, what sort of personality have you got and how does it fit? So some are specifically designed to measure a candidate's, say, role, the suitability for a role, or their suitability to use a certain sort of leadership style, for instance, and others are based around personalities that are required, or characteristics or aptitude that is required for certain roles. They all have different sort of slants, and we've got a couple coming up on the screen now. We've got ILM 72, MTQ 48, MBTI, that's Myers-Briggs, the VIA strengths, and OPQ 32. And we'll have a look quickly at these, and there's handouts on them, but they're just another method that can be used as part of that overall feedback we're looking on our sort of what we like and how we fit in. Right then, so we're going to start looking at some of these psychometric tests, assessments, and we're only going to briefly look at each model, but there are some links in the resources so you can do a bit more research and find out about them. And as part of the activity, you're going to be asked to do some. So ILM 72 is a behavioural model. It's measuring or assessing two important elements. One is the leadership style. That's your natural or preferred style, depending on your personality and characteristics. And secondly, the effectiveness or your behaviours when you use that leadership style. So one is what your natural style is, and secondly, are you using it effectively and is it working? Just because it's natural doesn't mean you are. Can be used by the employer or an organisation to match people to certain roles or to improve things, and can be used by the individual to become more self-aware of what their natural preference is and how effective they are at utilising it. So the report from an ILM 72 will give you, as it says there, suggested areas for development. It'll identify where and how leadership style may be developed for a given situation, so what you're good at, what you're not good at. It'll identify key skills and competencies that you need to develop for that leadership to be effective, and it'll give a reflection on how effective your leadership style is with the role or the organisation that you're working in. So that's ILM 72. Like I say, there is a link in the resource which gives you more details, and we'll move on. So the next one we're going to look at is MTQ 48. This is slightly different. It's focused around testing what they define as the mental toughness. They describe that as the mindset that every person adopts in everything they do, and can closely be linked to things we would normally talk about in character as resilience, grit, etc. It's set up to measure these qualities, whereas the previous one we looked at our behaviours, how we act, and some look at attributes. Mental toughness, the one they look at, is meant to be a key driver for developing those behaviours and attributes, and research that was done for it identified 4 key components in mental toughness. They called them the 4 C's, and they are, firstly, control. What do they mean by that? Well, they're talking about life control. Do I really believe I can do the things I've set out to do, and have I got control of it, and can I deliver that? And secondly, emotional control. Can I manage my emotions and the emotions of others? So that emotional intelligence we were talking about. The second, commitment. Do I set goals, as we talked about in self-awareness? Do I promise myself to do things, and am I always working towards those goals? And the other part was achievement. Do I have what it takes to keep those promises and achieve those goals? So we're talking about inner commitment there. The third was challenge. Am I a risk taker? Will I push myself? Am I success driven, and am I prepared to take that chance? And am I learning from my experiences? Even when I get setbacks, do I learn from them and see them as a positive and take them forward as an opportunity for learning? And then confidence. Am I confident in my own abilities, that I can do it, or that I can acquire the skills to improve to do it? And have I got the confidence to influence others? So interpersonal confidence. Can I influence others, and can I stand my ground if needed or if challenged? So all these areas were the areas that they identified as what they termed mental toughness for the MTQ48 test. And they can lead to improvements in performance, improved positive behaviours now that we know about them, improved overall well-being, they say, because we know about ourselves, we can feel better about ourselves, and then it'll lead to us improving our aspirations. So that's MTQ48. So now we'll take a look at MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, probably one of the most common ones, and it's a personality inventory. The idea is that we can look at the theory of psychological types and make them useful and make them understandable for people in their everyday lives. The essence is that we tend to think that we do things randomly, but our behaviours aren't random. According to Myers-Briggs, they're all down to basic differences in the ways individuals prefer to use their perception or their judgment. So they use these preferences and they use the responses to those to form into 4 dichotomies. They were around extroversion and introversion, sensing or intuition, thinking or feeling, and judging or perceiving. And those indicated your personality type once they'd looked at all the responses, and they came out with 16 types. And as you can see, we've got ISTJ through to the red one, which is ESTJ, which is what I came out as. So E was for extroversion, S was for sensing, T was for thinking, and J was for judging. And I remember finding it really useful just in the fact that it told me I'd be an active organiser, that I was logical, assertive, fact-minded, decisive, practical and results orientated, systematic, etc. And I remember questioning the person who was giving me the feedback, because it's done by a trained professional, and asking that I didn't agree with some of them, and they said, yeah, but what you got to remember is some of them may have been natural ones, and then with me being in the forces, things such as fact-minded and assertive may have been trained into me. So it can look at your natural types, and it can also show you where you've changed and where you've developed. And as we talked about in that self-awareness, you sometimes need to identify what you have done in the past and what's changed and what's been good and what's been bad. So can be useful, and again, we said these are only tools. We'll move on to the next. So the VIA Strengths Survey, as it's sometimes called, or assessment, is looking at your character strengths. The VIA identifies 24 character strengths, and they make evaluations on them. It's useful to understand them because what it talks about is working out which ones are going to make you flourish. So are you deploying your highest strengths to lead you to the best? And it talks about it all being based around your well-being, and they've got this phrase PERMA, about it producing more positive emotion, more engagement, better relationships, more meaning, and more accomplishment. So the whole thing is around you feeling better about yourself, and look at your character strengths and working out how you can use them to the best of your ability, and to be the most effective at what you're trying to do. And the final one we're going to take a look at is OPQ32. OPQ stands for Occupational Personality Questionnaire. Look at individuals' preferences and their personalities to see how they align with the job role. So as you can see, it can be used by an individual to look at how they fit, but also heavily used by employers in recruitment. Often the information from the assessment is used to explore further in subsequent interviews. So they use what they've gained from that to see how they're going to phrase their questioning and what they're going to work on and look at. Comes in 3 types that are normally used today. There's a normative one, which is just about scaling 1 to 5 reflective agreement on statements, and then these are compared with other people in similar sorts of roles or areas. So if it was a graduate one, it would be with other graduates' answers. If it was managerial, with other managerial areas, so and linked to whichever country they've come from as well. And then we've got the Ipsatif and the Ipsatif shorter format. These are just slightly different because they look at giving people 4 statements and they have to pick their best and worst out of those. And the reason employers like that one is because choosing 2 statements means that it's hard to distort what you want, so you can't learn to answer questions. You're picking your worst and your best, and then it does some sort of judgment based on that. The shorter format is just reducing the amount of questions due to the fact that the Ipsative one takes a long time and the shorter one takes about 30 minutes, so it's quite attractive to employers. So that's OPQ 32. And then we've got some more common things from the workplace, such as management tools, and they can include things such as something I've already mentioned, appraisals, that formal feedback we're getting against a set of agreed criteria from our manager that is giving us an overall thing of how we've done across perhaps the year, if it's an annual appraisal, where we need to go to improve ourselves, and that'll link into a personal development plan, which we'll be discussing a little bit later. There's also things like staff engagement surveys, because they can say if staff are engaged with us, it's telling us how we are as a leader and what we're doing. We would hope that they're feeling engaged and that they have some sort of relationship with us, but that survey is going to give us that feedback. There's also something called 360-degree feedback, which you can do a bit more research on because it can be quite complex, but as the visual shows, it's really just about getting a view from all stakeholders because they have a different perspective. For example, a customer thinking you're doing something really well might not be the same as your manager thinking you're doing it really well. Colleagues and managers can have different feelings as well about how you're treating them, what you're doing, and they're seeing it from a different perspective because your colleague or your worker may actually see you face to face. Your manager only may see the overall outcome or what happens at the end. And then there'll be things like reports, management reports, sales reports, production figures, all those sort of things go to provide feedback onto how well you're doing your job, and all should be taken into account when we're making ourselves aware, reflecting on what's been going on. But it is about a balance across all of them, and really self-awareness is about 360-degree feedback. And finally, unconscious bias tests. And first, I think we need to establish that we're all comfortable with unconscious biases. We all have some. It's come from our upbringing, our parents, perhaps from our time that we were born, or our culture. And the brain uses it to shortcut decision making because it bases it on experiences it's had or non-experience that it's had. So therefore it makes quick decisions based on the facts it's got. It all comes from the old point about dangerous situations and the amygdala in the brain, but we discussed earlier how the brain makes quick conscious decisions and it does them without us even realizing it. So we may be unconscious of the fact that we are being biased towards something because our brain is deciding for us. So we need to be aware and we need to think about it. And you can do an implicit association test. There is a free one in the examples, but this is just a weapon for us to be aware of our unconscious bias. It measures it, it gives us an understanding of any roots, stereotypes, any prejudices or preferences we may have. So don't go beating yourself up too much about it. It's natural. It's something that humans have done for a long time to survive. It's just what we do with it, and being aware of it can help us to protect. So let's have a little bit of a reflection on what we've covered so far and what we've been talking about. I hope we've established that there is a common theme to self-awareness, and that's about improving our performance and that of others by sort of improving the relationship and improving how we do things to make sure that things go better. So let's look at some specifics, and first let's look at our own performance. Hopefully we're calmer and more relaxed, and we know that if you're calmer and more relaxed, you're always going to do a better job, and that's because we recognize our triggers and we know how we're going to deal with them. Hopefully we've got a better understanding of ourselves and particularly how others perceive us, and we'll be more empathetic. Hopefully we're more mindful of our actions and how what we're doing might affect other people and might be perceived, and hopefully we can come up, now we know where our strengths, our weaknesses, our opportunities and our threats are, we can come up with clearer aims and goals, short term and also longer term. Hopefully it'll improve our credibility with other people because we're being more open and we're prepared to admit where we make mistakes, and we're prepared to be empathetic and understanding, and hopefully all that put together will make us more effective and productive And we're going to talk about how we can then use that in more time management planning and planning of our workload in one of the next sessions. And then, of course, as we talked about in emotional intelligence, it's not just about all about us, it's about how that impacts on others. And we should see improvements in better relationships with our colleagues, our peers, etc., because all those things we're doing and the way we understand them and the improved communication should build those better relationships. And those better relationships should work linked with those clearer goals, perhaps, and aims, should give us improved teamwork, and that's always going to help to improve productivity. And as that develops, all those things together, we should develop more trust and more honesty. If we're being honest about ourselves and being self-aware, then people are more likely to be honest with us. And hopefully we'll encourage them to become open-minded, to be more self-aware. If they see us doing it and we talk about it, because part of self-awareness perhaps will be talking about it and saying what we feel, and that should give us then the opportunity, to be more self-aware and be more like us. Right, so hopefully that's covered sort of gathering feedback and looking at how we can use it for ourselves. I want you to do the activity on gathering feedback and looking at your organisation and seeing where you think there are opportunities for feedback before we move on to the next session.